This is our first stop in our tour today in Akko, and this is the stop that most of you will never come to in a real life visit, because in Akko we simply do not have enough time. And when you guide a group from abroad, unlike an Israeli group, which may be very interested in this site, when you guide a group from abroad, the story of Akko is mainly the Crusaders' story. The Crusaders' halls, the Templar tunnel, and so on and so forth. So that will be focused on that. Some of you would perhaps want to have a break, a lunch break at Akko in one of the restaurants. That also takes about an hour. So you should take that into account. This site is probably going to be on your, not on your highest priority. But as some of you would perhaps wish to come here, I would highly advise you to revisit the site, revisit everything we do. Okay, that's an advice in general, but revisit especially this site, because there's a series of films in the rooms all along the where the arches are that focus on the story of the underground fighters who were arrested, and some of them were executed here in the Mandate period. It's very important. It takes a long time, about an hour, even more than that. So, of course, we can't spend that kind of time in this location at the moment. Jewish fighters, even though there were also Arab prisoners here. The story here focuses on the Jewish story of the underground. And of course, if you come from an Arab background, of course, perhaps you'd like to focus on the other side. And sometimes when we guide here, some of the members of my group, of the tour guide group, take the opportunity to elaborate on that. But this is a less known story, okay?
But when we say Jewish,
Winston Churchill once said that history is going to be very kind to him, because he's going to write it. So whoever writes history, obviously his approach is biased, and that is exactly what we see here. We need more research on the Arab side. We need more study of the Arab side. Obviously there is an Arab side here. There were more Arab prisoners here than Jewish prisoners, but it was less studied. And I think that this is also part of the history of this country. And therefore someone should take the challenge, I think, and do that. Anyhow, coming back to this story, here we have actually three focal points in the visit to the Museum of the Prisoners of the Underground. One, the earliest of them, is of course the story of the Ottoman era, when this site was turned into the Saraya, into the governor's palace, including a prison. That was already true in the time of Daher el-Omar and Ahmad al-Jazar, and it continued this way through the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And in the 19th century, a dignitary, a real VIP, even though he didn't know that at the time, was hosted here, unwillingly of course. And his name was Mirza Hussein Ali, known better perhaps as Baha'u'llah. Now you're going to study about Baha'u'llah mainly when you visit Haifa and the Baha'i Gardens, so I'm not going to elaborate on that, but let me just remind you that Baha'u'llah is the leading figure in the Baha'i movement, which emerged from Shiite Islam in Persia. Even though they branched off Shiite Islam, the Baha'is are definitely not Muslims, just like the Druze. The Druze also came from Shiite Islam in the 11th century, yet Druze are not, they're definitely not Muslims. Okay, so the Baha'is emerged from Shiite Islam in Persia in the middle of the 19th century, and they were persecuted by the Muslim authorities at the time. And the Muslim authorities at the time are the Turkish authorities. And eventually the Turks decide to exile Baha'u'llah to the Holy Land. Why? Because this is a remote area. It's not on the main path of anyone. This is the place where you could do the least damage in the eyes of the Turks. So he's exiled to Akko, and where in Akko? To this site. And his room is actually at the top of the staircase. I'm later going to send you and tell you what to look at, okay? But his room is at the second floor. There's a certain room with a sign on it telling you that this is the cell where Baha'u'llah resided. Now, he wasn't here alone. He came here in 1868, and he lived here for 2 years. He wasn't alone. He was with his family. Now, the place back then looked a bit different. Nowadays, it's maintained. Every dangerous feature is excluded. You can't go. Back then, it was a dangerous site, not because it was a prison, but because there were many pits, open pits all around. And Baha'u'llah's son, who was a young boy, stumbled upon one of these pits and eventually died. So he lost his son here. But eventually the Turks allowed him to leave the prison and to be at a house arrest not far from here at a place called the Baha'i Gardens, or Bahaji. Do not confuse that with the gardens at Haifa. I'm talking about gardens not far from here, on the way north, and they're called Bahaji, a small version of the Baha'i Gardens, less impressive, but this is the place where Baha'u'llah lived and died, and this is where he was also buried. So for Baha'is all over the world, the gardens near Akko are the most sacred place on earth. Not the gardens in Haifa. They are the second place in sanctity, and this is the first. So Baha'u'llah's story is focused on the second floor here, and even today Baha'is come to visit the site and see where he was imprisoned. Back then, in the 1860s, when he was imprisoned here, some members of his community wanted to be still in touch with him, to see him, to keep his spirit up, and of course that was difficult because the Turks wouldn't allow them in unless they committed a crime. But they decided not to go that path, and therefore they simply purchased the house I showed you earlier opposite the entrance with the blue windows. So this is a Baha'i property, and they resided there, and as Baha'u'llah's room, as you will see, had a window overlooking the sea, of course they could see him, he could see them, and the contact between the leader and his community was preserved. So that's one story here. The second story is from the 1920s, and I'm not going to elaborate on that because Noah is going to do so in a moment, but this is the story of the first Jewish prisoner in the under the British rule. The mandate period begins officially in 1922, but the British are here from 1970. So the British imprisoned here a man called Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who's a famous leader of the right wing in the politics of the 1920s, a man who had enormous influence on the ideology of the right wing in Israel in the 20th century and in the 21st century as well. So Ze'ev Jabotinsky was imprisoned here, and I'm not going to elaborate on that because this is the guiding point. So that's 1920, and his room is also on the second floor. And there's also, except for his room, there are also big signs telling the story of Ze'ev Jabotinsky and the story of the site in his time. And the third story here, the third focal point, perhaps the most important, is from the end of the mandate period, because this place served as a prison of both Jewish and Arab prisoners, but also as the gallows that is the execution site. And the gallows are located immediately under the staircase. You see the wide staircase? Yeah. Immediately under that there's an arch. This is the entrance to the gallows, and later when I'm finished I'd like you to go and take a look at that too. In 1947, there were 3 Jewish members of the underground who were imprisoned here and sentenced to death. Mordechai El-Kachi, Yechiel Dresner, and Eliezer Kashani. These were their names. All of them are nowadays streets in Armon HaNatziv, Jabal Mukaber, Armon HaNatziv in Jerusalem. The Jewish neighborhood is Armon HaNatziv. Opposite it is the village of Jabal Mukaber. So over there are streets named after the prisoners who were executed. They are part of of a larger number of prisoners who were imprisoned and executed by the British, known as the, anyone know the term? Harugei HaMalchut, those who were executed by the kingdom. It's an halakhic term, a Jewish law, ancient Jewish law term, referring originally to a group of sages who were executed by the Romans in the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. It was reused in the 20th century in the Jewish press to refer to the people who were executed by the British. These 3 awaited their sentence on April 47. The Etzel Underground decided to break into the prison to rescue them. However, on April 16th, they were executed, and the Etzel did not have any chance of rescuing them. But the plan to rescue prisoners here still remained active, and it was just postponed to May 4th. On May 4th, the forces of the Etzel attacked the prison from that side. Okay, this is the side where there's a hammam, a Turkish bath, which actually leans on the wall of the prison. So that was the only place where you could actually climb up to sufficiently high enough to break into the prison using explosives. But of course, you can't just go in and explode or a bomb anything. You have to do it wisely. So firstly, they did some intelligence work, and they realized that they have a problem because the Jewish prisoners were imprisoned on this side. The Arab prisoners were imprisoned over there. So and in between, there's a barrier, a locked gate. So if you break the wall on that side, what you basically do is you free the Arab prisoners, but you keep the Jewish prisoners in. That wasn't a good idea, they thought. And therefore, they smuggled into the prison explosives. And they told the prisoners, once you hear the great explosion on that southern side, you need to get to the gate between you and the Arab prisoners, bomb it, break through, and then you'll find a breach in the wall outside. We'll wait for you. 41 members of the underground were planned to be rescued. There were many more, but there was not sufficient space to hide them. Why not? There were so many Jews over here in this country at that time. Couldn't they find 70, 80, 100 families willing to host the prisoners? No, they couldn't, because the prisoners were the Etzel. And most of the Yeshuv, most of the Jewish settlement was anti-Etzel, was Haganah, was basically there was a great fissure, hatred between the different movements in this country at the time. And so there was simply not enough people who were willing to hide them. So they decided that 41 is the capacity, and therefore only 41 prisoners who were chosen before the operation took place, they will be released. And on Sunday, 4 in the afternoon, it's very important because Sunday is the time when the British troops have some time off on the beach, and they're less alert for the afternoon. They just drank some whiskey, so they will be probably less effective. At that time, the members of the Etzel of the underground, disguised as telephone technicians. That's why they brought a ladder with them. That looks very natural. They climbed on the arch connecting the prison with the bathhouse and bombed the wall, basically breaching through, and everything went according to plan. The prisoners broke the gate and joined the friends outside. However, nothing works perfectly, and the sound of the explosion alerted the British forces on the beach. They were here too quickly. It wasn't planned to be this way. They reacted very quickly, and as a result, a battle begins between the British and the underground members. In the battle that ensued, many were killed, many were captured, and as a result, only 27 members of the Etzel found their way out. However, hundreds of Arab prisoners managed to escape. So it was a great success from the Arab perspective, not from the Jewish perspective. Now, the point was also that 3 members of the underground were caught by the British. They were imprisoned here, and they were sentenced to death. Avshalom Chaviv, Meir Nakar, and Yaakov Weiss, they were imprisoned here, sentenced to death. The Etzel decided to kidnap 2 British sergeants, and they threatened that these sergeants will be hanged if the underground members will be hanged. The British didn't believe they would dare do that, so they hanged the 3. And as a result, the sergeants were also hanged. Later, it was found that one of the sergeants was actually a Jew. Yes. It was a real tragedy. The entire story is a real tragedy, but as a result, the British stopped hanging members of the underground. Some historians claim that the shock, there was truly a huge shockwave throughout the British Empire due to the daring action, breaking into this guarded, secure prison, the success of releasing 27 people, that came as a shock to the British government, and some historians claim that this is one of the reasons why eventually the public opinion turned against continuing ruling this land, and eventually the British decided to leave the country. Others disagree with that, and they would claim that there are other more important reasons, geopolitical reasons for that. But I think that one may indeed accept the claim that there was some influence, perhaps not a major influence, but some influence to the act. So this is the story of the break into the prison on May 4th, 1947. And a little story which has nothing to do with the great story of the Great Escape happened slightly earlier in this room, room number 28, which I'd like to ask you to visit later too. Room 28 was one of the rooms where Jewish prisoners were imprisoned before the Great Escape, and they wished to find a way out of the prison. And they decided that they should dig their way out. So they started digging a hole in the wall, concealing it, of course, with all types of objects so the British won't observe it and won't detect it. And they dug sufficiently enough under the floor to send down one man to check things up. That man, as the hole was very narrow, the man chosen was a member of the underground, a Yemenite guy, very small, very thin, slim guy. He managed to squeeze in, and he reported that he felt a breeze of fresh air, meaning they're probably on the right track. Luckily for them, they were transferred before the mission was completed. Why luckily? Because had they completed it, they would have found. that they were actually digging into the infrastructure of this magnificent Ottoman building, and they would be digging basically into an even larger prison, which is the Hospitaler command center of Akko from the 12th century. And believe you me, its walls were even thicker. So they were not disappointed to find out. Sorry?
What equipment they used?
Spoons, basically, metal tools that they made from the spoons that they received. Traditional way, yes. And of course, they had to get rid of the mud and earth. So they would go out. You see, this is the courtyard. This is where they do their daily stroll. So in doing so, they released every time a small amount of earth, but that would be detectable, of course, at some point. So they decided to throw it into the toilets. And obviously that caused a blockage. Several times local technicians were involved in cleaning the toilets, and no one suspected that an escape attempt is on its way. So these things sometimes happen. Anyhow, that was a great failure. So we have here actually 3 or 3.5 stories. Baha'u'llah at the top, Jabotinsky, the gallows, room 28, and the great escape, which we're going to see from the outside sometime later. But I left Jabotinsky's story
to Noah.
For Noah. Where is Noah? There he is. So we're waiting for you.